Awesome. All right. So I want to welcome everyone to tonight's topic, adaptive reuse. Look at an opportunity. So what if we can repurpose existing buildings as homes? What is the opportunity? And what are the challenges do we face? So I'm really excited about this topic because it has so many connection points to many challenges we face. But I'm also really looking forward to welcome all the panelists and to get their insights and stories, what that means actually in praxis, and how do we make it work? Now, before we jump in, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Evitat acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. And we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people today. We are here to listen, learn, and build a future together. I welcome Antony from Antony. He's the director of DiMase Architects. And I will give you in a few seconds a chance to introduce yourself as well. I also want to welcome Simone Schenker. She's back as a co-host to this session. Really happy about this. Myself, of course, as a co-founder of Evitat. And also welcoming Daniel, who is managing in the background all the surveys, all the questions which might come through, hopefully come through. And he is more than happy to take on any of your questions also and pass them on later on to Antony or Simone as well. Antony, I give you a little bit the opportunity to introduce yourself before we jump into the main topic.
Sure. So Antony DiMase is my name. I'm an architect. I've been working in architecture for quite some time. I've been running my own practice for the last 22 years with essentially a strong focus in adaptive reuse or creative reuse, or however you want to see it, renovations of existing buildings. It's something I'm really interested in and passionate about because I think the sustainability argument is really easy to make when you are refurbishing or renewing existing infrastructure. So yeah, I've also got a master's in lighting. I have a particular interest in daylight design, very interested in sustainability and knowledge sharing, I guess. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
And on that note, we have been talking to Antony many times and went through the projects. I think it holds a lot of these stories directly around the topic tonight. Really adaptive reuse in general, actually trying to preserve the existing building and improving that one to give it a new lease of life, which is a really nice context and great opportunity probably for an architect to be also creative. So on that note, I want to jump and give a little bit of context why this topic is something we really need to discuss, to have conversations about, because there are some contradictions around the built environment. The built environment on one side has an urgent need also to fulfill the need around, growing population, the demand for housing. And in the next 5 to 10 years, we basically need every year to build 250,000 new homes or establish them somehow to meet actually that demand. But if we convert that, for example, in emissions, in particular, when we are considering embodied carbon emissions, it adds a huge bill to the total of Australia carbon emissions. And it equals nearly 25 million new petrol cars on our roads. So this is the context to put actually a little bit the topic from tonight as well into perspective. But then we're also going to talk probably to the even immediate challenges around housing and how do we meet that demand. So, but one more. Adaptive reuse is the topic of tonight, and in the classic sense, it is actually repurposing of an existing structure for a new use. And there's a lot of really big opportunities to unlock with that concept. And Antony, I think this is something you have tapped in many of your projects on and tried actually to work that into the concepts, into the solutions. How do you look at your experience with adaptive reuse, and how do you actually see adaptive reuse?
Well, I think I can say a few things in relation to adaptive reuse. It's certainly become very popular in the architecture world at the moment. There seems to be a real interest globally for, amongst architects for adaptive reuse, which is really great. And I mean, it's always been there. I think there's always been this kind of field of architecture, which is adaptive reuse. But I guess the idea of building new buildings, new homes, new skyscrapers, new educational facilities always had the sort of, the glamour side to it, the sort of trophy sort of aspect to it. But I think what we're seeing now is a real shift towards adaptive reuse as being a really important part of architecture. I think we're seeing a lot of movement in this space just across the board, because I think we're all realizing that to build a new building that is, whether it's a 6-star, 7-star new home, doesn't take into account that there is a lot of existing buildings that just don't meet, a minimum standard, particularly in rental accommodation. There's just so many buildings out there that need maintenance, need upgrade, and rather than demolish those buildings and building new buildings, often those new buildings, particularly if it's a developer who's developing a site, you're not getting the sort of quality that existed, say, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago when when original buildings were built. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think there's just a lot of movement in this space. I think you asked me specifically what the challenges were for me. Is that right, Sonia? Sorry, I went on.
Yeah. So
okay, so the challenges are that when you're documenting, I think I'm trained as an architect, as a fairly conventional architect, and we produce drawings, we produce the building, the builder builds the building, and the clients move in. With adaptive reuse, you need a different kind of mentality to the working drawings, to the way in which you approach it, and the way in which you communicate to builders. And I liken projects that involve adaptive reuse a bit more like event planning. The sequence of work is so critical to the outcome. You can't just sort of knock things out and start again. You have to be so sensitive to the existing fabric. If you're serious about adaptive reuse, you actually have to kind of pull apart the building in very carefully, understand what's actually valuable in the existing building, and upgrade it. So the skill set that's required for adaptive reuse is quite different to the sort of traditional model that architects are trained under.
Yeah, absolutely. So that holds, I guess, some really interesting aspects, but of course also a lot of challenges. Not every architect might be familiar with it. On the flip side, let's say, on the opportunity side, what are these benefits we can tap into when talking about adaptive reuse?
So I think adaptive reuse just has so many benefits. It's sort of almost hard to know where to start. But if you think about a building that exists, any building, a house, a church, I don't know, a bus shelter for any sort of building that exists, that has existed in that place for a period of time. Generally speaking, the sort of social structure that supports that building is in place. The pathways, the connections to services, the gardens, just the way things actually work. So by reusing or upgrading that building, you're maintaining all of those things that have taken quite a long time to establish. So rather than just demolishing it and kind of starting again, you're actually building on what's already there. Some of those things are kind of quite hidden from view in a way, just the pathways, the way that the building functions. So I feel that adaptive reuse taps into a kind of, the pre-existing life that exists on that site, and you're just making it better. I think the other thing that is really interesting about adaptive reuse is that when you take a space, and I think this is one of the challenges that architects have, is when you take an existing space and you reimagine it as an adaptive reuse project, the drawings don't sort of reveal the benefit that's going to come from it, because you're not presenting a beautiful design. You're just sort of saying, this is the work that we need to do. But often when the building or the project gets completed, I think people are really astounded by just the benefits of putting in new windows, putting in insulation, changing the colours of the materials or the surfaces, and, putting in new joinery. They have this massive impact. You've already got something that you like, because otherwise why would you reuse it?
Yep.
And you're sort of making it better. So you just get this real kick. You get this real surprise at the end of the job as to how much better the project can be.
And it carries all the character, the past, the stories, and maybe one even really big consideration, what you tapped on is, the infrastructure around it. Usually buildings like these have been built maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago. So they usually are in a well-established surrounding, which makes a huge benefit to the owners or the occupants. So I think that this is a beautiful benefit really to highlight, because they often enough in like maybe even walking proximity to public transport and so on. So it's really something to worthwhile to preserve, and also to probably really with architectural input to reimagine and then make it work and giving it a new lease.
Yeah,
and
I think
it's yeah.
If we stay on housing, and I know that Evitat's focus is on housing, it's a really interesting thing. It's not one way or the other, by the way. And I think there are times where demolition is appropriate, and there are lots of times that it's not. It's just when it becomes the default that demolition is taken, where I sort of oppose to. You can walk the streets wherever the people who are attending this webinar live, and you'll see, let's say, a 1930s building, a single house on a large allotment, usually has quite established gardens if the people who lived there were, had an interest in gardens, and kind of interesting architecture, because it came from an era where there was a bit more craftsman. And often when these buildings get demolished, we get, let's say 4 or 6 villa units. And in that equation, what gets lost is the character and the productive garden and an established house which had a lot of craft associated with it. In its place, we get something that I think, we can argue has a lack of character often. Small gardens and, a real reliance on technology to make work. And in that transition from these older buildings to the newer buildings, and we have got a housing crisis. So again, that's why I say it's not cut and dry. We lose something in that transaction. And it's something that we really need to be mindful of, because once it starts sweeping through our suburbs, our inner suburbs and established suburbs, we lose more than we gain sometimes. And I don't think that the architecture that we're getting in place of the buildings that are being demolished really set us up for a really interesting cultural future. And we only need to look at, Europe as an example. There are such strong heritage, which we have here as well, but, depending on where you are, obviously, but, you know, a place like Rome or Florence or wherever, they really preserve their history. You know, they really see the value of the significance of heritage, and everything that happens in those sort of places is so incremental, building on the past, so that you can't actually see where the building stops and starts. You know, it's actually really fluid, really beautiful.
Yeah, it's
We actually have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I might interrupt for a second,
Yeah,
Sonia.
no
We have a
worries.
question from the audience that it's kind of appropriate here. Yeah, someone's kind of asking maybe more in terms of sustainability. How do you balance the preservation of cultural and historical elements with kind of the need of modern sustainability kind of aspects? Because I imagine there's probably a bit of tension there sometimes. So how do you kind of balance those things?
Well, I don't know if it's a case of balancing, because I think the retention of existing buildings, I assume what the individual is saying is potentially the original building is inefficient, let's say, and you're wanting to create a more highly efficient building. I'm guessing that's what's being suggested by that question. I think everything can be improved. I mean, you know, like if you take let's just use a star system. Let's say 1 is very inefficient and 5 is, you know, very efficient, just for the purposes of this discussion. Let's say a heritage building starts off as a 1-star building, right? There are a number of measures that we can take to improve that to, say, 3 or 4 stars. It gets hard to get to 5 stars, truth be known, but we can easily get to 3 stars or 4 stars. And I would suggest that if we did that broadly across the across the community, across the suburbs of Melbourne or Sydney or wherever, we are doing a lot. We're making a great we're making big strides into, you know, solving a whole bunch of issues. We're also getting better health outcomes for people who live there, and we're making the spaces that are there more usable. You know, we talk about the housing crisis. In fact, many buildings have got vacant rooms, vacant bedrooms that are simply not being used. So we can make these buildings actually more vibrant, more usable for the occupants that actually live there.
Yeah, I think there's definitely also always a pathway in terms of thermal efficiency and improvements to the structure to get there. Also around budgets, I think that's something, cost and budget, or in general costs. We will tap onto this as well. But I think because you are working with an existing structure, you have definitely some possible savings. So what's in your experience around the whole topic around costs and savings around adaptive reuse? Like, is it basically eaten up by the additional work and investigations around the structures? And so how does it balance that part?
I think there's no blanket rule. Adaptive reuse, you know, is you know, there are, you know, in terms of cost, it's not easy to say it's less expensive than a new build. You know, it's very project contingent, very project specific. To some extent, the advantages of adaptive reuse is you have a level of control, a greater control over cost, in my opinion. So the extent to which you adaptively reuse a building depends on the owner. So to give you an example, we could decide, if we were, you know, refurbishing the offices that are around me, to insulate the ceiling and the walls, but, you know, we wouldn't put double glazing in because we can't afford it. To some extent, that choice is mine, you know. But when I do a new building, you know, I kind of have, you know, especially if it's a new dwelling, I'm now committed to a 7-star outcome, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong. But I am committed to that. I am committed to meeting that requirement. So to some extent, I would suggest that with adaptive reuse, you do have a level of control over the expenditure, and you need to be really sensible about how you do that, because no one wants to break the bank. So I think that's one of the advantages of adaptive reuse, is that you actually you actually have that control over the outcome. But it can, truth be known, it can cost more than a new build. And truth be known is that it is also less efficient, So, when you're adaptively reusing a building, you've got this issue where you've got to kind of pull the building apart to some extent, do whatever work you need to do, and then reinstate it back to where it once was. So you're kind of taking one step back and then two steps forwards to get to more or less the same position that you started with. But in doing that, the benefits are massive, I think, because you're getting a much better, you're getting a building that performs a lot better than what it did originally.
Yeah. Simona, do you have any additional questions on that note? Maybe.
Yeah, thanks so much, Antony. It's really, really interesting. One thing, maybe what I'm wondering, if people wonder about what is the potential of an existing building, if it's really suitable for adaptive reuse, where do you see the balance? What does a building have to have that can you reuse it, or at what point would you say it's probably best to start from scratch?
Yeah, I think this is really critical. I mean, I think there is all buildings have a life, more or less, and I don't think we can shy away from that. I think, and the decision to either knock down an existing building or reuse it is a really critical decision. So, that's probably where I would involve an architect or expertise in relation to this issue, because, if you're a tin shed that, just doesn't perform, it probably makes sense not to maintain that. But a heritage building in an established suburb that has what we might term good bones, good structure, good infrastructure, good orientation, the bones of the building, as we like to say, which refers to the skeleton, the structure of it, is in good shape, then I would suggest it should be retained. I don't think orientation counts as much as people might think. I think that it's really about the structure. The structural integrity is really critical in this whole equation as to whether I would, advise a potential client on the reuse of an existing building.
What I often say as well is, if there's a lot of mold in the house, that can be really critical to get under control. Even, you might be able to patch over it, but, you might not get fully rid of it, which can be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, I mean, that's right. If there's something that is really systemic, whether it's rising damp or, just really poorly laid out rooms, or, cracks in the wall that, would require so much underpinning, and, a whole bunch of stuff that come together, you have to kind of accept. We do work for the Department of Education, and they're often having to make an assessment as to whether a building is preserved or rebuilt. And they have a fairly simple equation that if the reuse of that building is somewhere around the 60 to 70% of the cost of rebuilding it, then they will go to rebuilding. So that kind of equation, I think, sort of makes sense. I think, because there is an advantage to new building. If you do it properly, you've got new materials, new layout, high performance glass and all those sorts of things. So I think there's an economic consideration that if the cost of refurbishing is so great, well, then you would have to start to think seriously about demolition, I would suggest.
And you mentioned before that, the structure needs to be right, and, the house needs to have good bones. But what are some most common structural issues you can still encounter when you work with existing conditions?
Well, like in Melbourne, we have a very reactive soil. So a lot of clay here in Melbourne. So what happened, and then, the footings, the foundation system that were used in the 19th century and early 20th century meant that we didn't have footings that were really deep. We didn't use concrete. So you get perennial cracking when the moisture changes. And that's really hard to fix. You need to underpin, and that's costly. But even underpinning can sometimes not resolve that issue. So buildings that were typically built, you know, from the sort of golden era of buildings from a structural point of view in Australia, I would argue was anywhere from sort of 1930, maybe 1940, right through to 1980. Typically, structurally, the buildings from that era were very good. Now, that's not to suggest that Victorian buildings also, there are some very fine examples of Victorian buildings, and there are some very fine buildings from the early Edwardian period as well. But in that sort of, you know, 40-year period, generally speaking, the structural components of buildings were very sound. So then it becomes a case of refitting out those buildings with, you know, more contemporary joinery, better electricity, power supply, and all those sorts of things.
That makes sense. And you spoke already a little bit about it. You know, how do the building codes and regulations impact the adaptive reuse projects, you know, compared to new construction? You said already that you could pick some of the features, you know, you don't have to put in new glazing everywhere, whereas with a new building you have to. But what are some other things that come into play that people have to be mindful of?
Well, when they're reusing an existing building.
Yep.
The critical thing is really the sequence of work. I mean, I can't stress that enough. And you know, got to think about the process. So if we're taking an existing building, you know, when do you rip up the floor? When do you take out the ceiling? When do you put in the new lighting? It becomes so critical how you sequence the work that has a really big impact on the project. And that's why, to some extent, the biggest challenge I would argue is that builders and tradespeople are not necessarily the best equipped to do this work. You will find in this sort of space that there's a lot of, you know, sort of what I would, you know, like retired handymen or, you know, social workers, or, you know, people who do little kitchen renovations or bathroom renovations, or they're young people who are starting out in the business who are, you know, like who'll do a little backyard deck for someone, or they actually have the sort of skills that you need in this space, which they're kind of very talented in a range of different areas that can kind of coordinate this work. But your straight up builder who you know, is classically trained, shall we say, or the plumber who's very classically trained, they struggle a little bit with this space. So there's a whole different skill set that's required, in my opinion, for this work. You do see it in heritage, you know, like there's a lot of heritage people out there, but heritage is such a small component of the building industry, but it's that skill set that's required in this sort of work.
Yeah,
very interesting, actually. Yeah, it's a really good advice, you know, to consider when really maybe thinking of repurposing an existing building for work, actually. But I think this is really very important, actually, advice to carry with and to process as well. Maybe on that side, what else would you give, for example, as advice for a homeowner when it comes to addressing their architects or designers, builders, trades, wanting to consider, for example, to include these kind of work? So what else might be really important as well to address?
Look, I think there's, in terms of if you're briefing an architect on the adaptive reuse of a building or a builder, obviously there's no point going to someone who hasn't got experience in that area. I think having experience, and you know, I would encourage anyone who's sort of thinking along these lines to also give consideration to young architects who are who perhaps may have just started their studio. So that contradicts something that I've just said earlier. But my point, the reason why I bring this up is that, in a sense, when I started my practice, which was 22 years ago, I had worked in other practices prior to that, so I wasn't young, so to speak. But my point is, my first commissions were bathrooms, kitchens, and renovations for friends and family. So they, in a sense, got me into this area, you know. So I kind of you know, through kind of necessity in work that I could get, I got work in what you might term adaptive reuse. So the reason why I bring this up is that the enthusiasm that an architect might bring to a project like an adaptive reuse project, and if they're a younger firm, I think they will bring something really special to the project. They'll bring their enthusiasm and their passion and, you know, really deliver, I think, the clients a really good outcome, because they're using that project for to set up their practice, which helps them, but and the client gets the enthusiasm of that younger practitioner who's really wedded and really interested in the outcome. So I think I would really say to anyone who's here tonight is to look at younger architects for this sort of work, because they can look at the problem in a different way to sort of established architects and architects who perhaps need those really big jobs for, you know, to make their practices run, I suppose.
Yep. Simona,
we have just one more. We have another question from the audience. I might jump in if that's okay. I guess there's kind of this question, I guess Antony and Simona as well, is kind of around, obviously we're reusing buildings and kind of giving them new life for another 50 years or so, if not longer. And obviously the impacts of climate change will be coming in more and more strongly. I guess the question is kind of around, what are you kind of doing today, and what can we think about in terms of protecting these buildings, make them more resilient to extreme weather events and rising temperatures? And is that kind of an important consideration for these kind of projects?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, that something in our own home that we're you know, like, I think, you know, insulation, reducing the need for energy, the ability to create a sort of safe place for yourself. When we talk about resilient buildings, what we're really talking about is just more extreme weather, longer, hotter summers. It's interesting because when I started as an architect, we really talked to, you know, it was really about heating houses, you know, like in Melbourne. Now it's about cooling. You know, cooling is really critical because we get these really long, hot summers, because, you know, it's hard to remember how it's all happened, but, you know, you would have a hot spell of, say, 2 or 3 days, and then there'd be a cool change and the house would cool down. You know, this is pre-air conditioning becoming highly prevalent. But, you know, I think what we're seeing now is much hotter summers. So we don't get that relief as quickly. You know, we don't get those days where it just cools down and then you can open up the house and the whole thing sort of, you know, starts again. So we're having to really think about buildings to protect the sort of the sort of indoor environment for much, much longer. So the resilience is really critical, and particularly as we're talking about an aging population, being able to, you know, live safely at home for longer is becoming really critical. So I take the view that resilience, we need to create resilient housing so that people can stay in their houses for longer and stay comfortable for longer, because we run the risk of creating really unhealthy homes that could potentially, you know, do enormous damage to the occupants. And we just don't want that. We just don't want that.
Yeah, that's a really important consideration actually in adaptive reuse projects, to build really for climate readiness, climate resilience, and it's possible. I think we will tap exactly into that with one of your projects, Antony, and we're introducing the Joneses house. And it's a really nice example actually of adaptive reuse. Can you maybe tell us a little bit what it was previously, where it is located, and what has happened actually during that brief, and how it turned into a home?
Well, it's in West Melbourne. It's my client is a lighting designer. It was a warehouse in West Melbourne. I don't exactly know what its prior use was, but it had been converted by a developer into a spec house. It was a very poor quality house. So the actual shape and everything that you see there was actually, in a way given to us by the developer. Essentially, we with the client, essentially pulled apart the building in terms of the plasterboard, the floors and so on, and insulated it, sealed it, put high quality windows and doors in, and put in a heat recovery unit internally, which meant that the spaces worked really, really, really well. It's a very comfortable space. It's really a little haven in inner city Melbourne. So you get these, it feels like when you go there, it's very quiet, very beautifully lit, partly because the client was a lighting designer, but also because, we used daylight in a really interesting way. And we had, it's just set in this, really busy environment, but when you're in this house, it felt like a bit of an oasis. We used passive house principles. We didn't get passive house certification, but we did, meet the requirements of the blower door test and heat recovery unit. And, it's a very efficient building from that point of view. So it really started my love affair for passive house and the standard that a passive house sets for us as architects. And it's something that I really advocate very strongly for, because the thing that I like about passive house is that it sets a standard for the amount of energy that can be used in a year. And we as architects can deliver that, by using the techniques and the technology that's available. So it means that we don't get the opportunity to greenwash what we're doing. We're actually saying, look, we're applying a standard that is universally accepted as a good standard. A reputable organisation has put this together, and we're delivering that standard to you as a client. So I really like it from that point of view, because otherwise, how do you actually know whether an architect is actually doing the right thing by, if they're claiming to be a sustainable architect? So passive house, I think, sets a really high standard, a high benchmark for us, and it's for us to meet that standard, which, people like Simone and others do. Sorry, I just called him. Sorry, I should have turned that off, shouldn't I? So that's something that I really like.
Simone, do you have any particular questions around the passive house principles or actually how to, make that work with an existing building structure and achieve such high benefits?
Yeah, can you maybe tell a little bit, what did you have any challenges, trying to make the existing house, as airtight as possible? Where did you start? Or were there some learnings, did you discover something that you would do differently next time?
There were lots of challenges, because we wanted to maintain the existing steel glass windows. So we had to retrofit double glazing into those windows. We had to put a particular type of paint on the steel windows to stop the thermal bridging. It was quite an invasive project. Like, we actually did a lot of work on this to get the air tightness. We achieved the air tightness. I think if I was to be brutally honest about the project, this was was the first passive house project that we were involved with. Essentially, we've only been involved in 3 in our time. I'd love to be involved with more. But I think what I learned is that when it comes to suppliers of sustainability products and materials, there's a lot of greenwashing out there, or there's a lot of promises that are made that don't necessarily bear up to the scrutiny. So I would encourage, and this is why I think Evitat are really good, and this is not a plug for them, like a paid plug or anything like that, but I think the purpose of having people out there who can, really rationalize the benefits of a product or a material or a supplier, who can actually put those things, interrogate those things, is just so valuable for us as architects, because there is just a lot of greenwashing out there. And I think that would be what I would suggest is the biggest challenge that we face in the sustainability we architects who are interested in delivering a sustainability outcome, because we're really, our focus is on the design, the delivery, and all those things. And, it's really hard to interrogate each individual supplier, each individual contractor as to their sustainability credentials. And so that's the thing that I learned specifically with this particular project.
Yeah. Usually there's just not the time, like you said, to look into every single supplier. And so typically if doing a passive house, the easiest way is that you just get certified passive house components, being it windows, insulation, whatever, then it's fairly easy. But I imagine with those steel windows, you had to look into many, many different things, and, there isn't a straightforward answer. But as soon as you do something like this, you typically run into problems. It takes longer, much more time resolved, involved for everyone. So it can make it quite challenging.
Yeah, I think, well, this one's this project is about 10 years old now, so it's quite, but it, so, a lot, we've moved forward quite a lot in that time, so we're actually, like, I think we're in a better place now than we were then.
Yeah, much more products available now.
Yeah, many more products, and I think more knowledge. I mean, virtually every CPD, continuing professional development seminar, is about sustainability or has a sustainability focus about it. So, that knowledge is much more disseminated in the community, and, retrofitting and refurbishing of existing buildings is much more openly discussed, and is really the flavour of the month at the moment. And I think it'll be that way for some time.
Yeah.
Were there any elements of the place, Antony, that I'm looking back at it now and kind of what you know now and how the scene is developing? Anything you look at in this project think, oh, I actually would have done that a bit differently now?
I can honestly say no. It's one of my favourite projects. It's something that I'm really proud of. I mean, I'm not being boastful, but it is really just a lovely, lovely project, and the clients were really terrific. And I wish I could get projects like this every day of the week, but they're rare. They're extremely rare. Two clients who were so committed to achieving good sustainability outcome. It was never a question in their mind that this was not something that they didn't want to do. They really embraced it. It was just second nature for them to do what was needed to deliver a good sustainability outcome.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a beautiful project, and actually on a small footprint, which I really love as well. So maybe just to tap on materials, what was maybe one really positive surprise where you had to find, something that fits actually the considerations of making it work, so you couldn't actually tap into a standard choice, but what was really surprisingly working really well?
Well, one product, perhaps less from a sustainability point of view and more from a design point of view. So this entryway here sort of sits outside of the passive house sort of zone. With passive house, you have a demarcation, you have a thermal envelope, which parts are sort of within the passive house and which parts sit outside. So this entry sits outside of it, which is essentially like a mud room. So before you enter into the main house, so to speak, there's a big door that sort of, from this space on the right-hand side of your screen, we go into the main house. So you can see that frosted glass. That's called channel glass, which came from Germany. It was pre-cut in Germany.
Okay.
It's used in Germany as an industrial way of constructing buildings. So it's just this beautiful frosted glass. So not from a sustainability point of view, but just purely aesthetic. It was just amazing getting this glass and seeing how it all fitted together, and having to do it so precisely because it was angled, and so it all had to be measured exactly right. And then it was shipped over from Germany, and they delivered it on a Friday, and they just left it in the laneway over the weekend.
Oh my God.
Thousands and thousands of dollars of this channel glass, which was just sitting in the laneway for 3 days, I think 2 or 3 days. And it was like, oh my God. Anyway, that was very exciting. So materials, that was one. we also used a material, I think it was called Gutex, which was this, which is like wheat bix. You might know of it, but it's this material, because we had these dividing walls between the our building and the neighbour's building, so we couldn't insulate inside the cavity wall. We had this product called Gutex, which reminds me of wheat bix. And it's just an amazing material in the way that it's applied to walls and then rendered. Gives a fantastic finish. You know, I really like that material and what it does. You know, you can almost feel the warmth coming from it. So the slide on your left, the wall on the left of that, so behind the bookshelf, is all Gutex with this amazing wheat bix product, I call, and then rendered. And it's just, yeah, amazing what it does.
It carries that industrial, like the because it reminds me a lot actually on the typical industrial warehouses, for example, also from Germany, where you have these really thick walls with renders and paints and everything. So it probably resembles that as well, but with a much better probably thermal efficiency as well. I don't know, like I haven't heard about it, but we'll definitely investigate a little bit.
Yeah, there's a person from South Australia who imports it over from, I'm not sure whether it comes from Germany or not, but it's an amazing product.
Is it like, what is it based off? Like not wood fiber?
It's essentially a wood fiber. It's essentially
okay.
a very loose wood fiber, and you get it of different thicknesses. It's essentially like a form, it's an insulation, but it's a sort of rigid board, but it's fairly fragile.
Yeah.
But it holds its shape, so it can be applied to walls, and then it has the characteristic that it can be rendered over and then painted. So it was perfect for that intertenancy wall, for the wall between the two buildings, because we couldn't insulate in between the existing walls and we couldn't insulate on the other side. So it has fairly specific purposes, but it works a treat.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, we have also, like, even on our database, we have a similar rigid wood fiber material, and it can be rendered in particular. Maybe just to add a little bit of information, if you are rendering it, it contains actually the vapopermeability, so it adds, you know, to this really healthy indoor air environment, which is a great way actually to improve thermal efficiency, but also to keep actually that entire space really healthy, and so in many cases also to avoid additional mold build up and everything. So it's a great solution to consider, and there's various manufacturers as well, and probably is something which is very or more commonly used across Europe, in particular the northern countries of Europe. But it's a great choice, and it becomes more and more popular here as well. So I'm really looking forward to have more suppliers and manufacturers having actually different choices, but it's great. Yeah. So
like you said, Antony, a few years ago you had to import everything. Luckily now there are a few suppliers in Australia, so it's getting easier.
No, absolutely.
So this project was actually really well rated. In particular, when we are looking at the time it was done and all the challenges. So you have achieved 7.1 star rating for this one, which is amazing. And can you just tell us a little bit how long it took in terms of the repurposing work actually applied to it?
Well, it took about 12 months to build. I mean, most projects of this sort of scale take about 12 months. So yeah, it was a good project. I mean, it was from a building point of view, it was quite good because it was sort of isolated, and there was a reasonable amount of space to work within. So, you know, fundamentally, we didn't change what was there. We just was, again, it was this sort of repurposing. I mean, but we sort of, in effect, pulled the sort of components apart and then sort of rebuilt them. You know, it's like the Bionic Man, you know, we kind of built it better. You know, what was a very leaky, you know, aluminium windows, single glazed, you know, not much insulation. Yeah, just a very leaky building. It's like living in a tent, I would imagine. You know, just going there just felt very fragile, very developer-like. You know, it was not chipboard, but FC sheet on the outside with, you know, just, you know, very cheap render. So, you know, we just made it into something better.
Nice. Amazing. Yeah. I know this is not the typical adaptive reuse, but this is your own home. And you have actually repurposed. It taps also into that idea to continue that lease of life and extend it with some applied renovation choices. And how are you progressing with your own project? Because you did mention in our last webinar that you're doing it room by room. So where are you today?
Yeah. Well, we've so I would say this is a typical adaptive reuse. Yeah, I think this is.
Yes.
I think this is the reality of what you confront when you're doing adaptive reuse. And you know, my son, who's 22, is actually doing the work. So it's been really great training for him. This is my other son's bedroom, and it's a much better place than it was. You can see the windows that are there. They've been replaced now with some really good quality windows, double glazed, really well sealed. That the windows that are there are really leaky. There was no insulation in the walls. We've now put insulation in the ceiling, in the floor, and the walls. You know, got the that's the front room, which we did, which is my room, my room, and my wife's room. You know, insulating the floors, putting in the insulation in the walls, getting a better heating system. You know, it just makes a massive difference, and the health benefits are just enormous. You know, going to sleep not, you know, needing to wear a beanie, you know, not having, you know, condensation on the windows, which my wife complained about for many, many years. And, you know, finally we've got double glazing, you know, and there's such good people who are working in this industry now. We had a company called Thermawood who did the windows in the bay window, and they did a fantastic job, you know, just sealing up around things and just taking that attention to detail really makes a difference. And essentially what you're doing is you're getting the same room, but just performing so much better. And it just, you know, just gives you so much, yeah, it just makes you feel so good when you do it, because just the benefits are there. You can feel them. You don't see them, but you feel them.
Yeah, that's the sad thing, Antony. I always think, you know, we would need a way to put thermal comfort on images or videos. You know, you can't see it. It's a shame, but you know, you really have to experience it.
Yeah, and it's just like, you know, our heating costs are reduced. You know, we're warm at night, and you wake up feeling good. You know, and things like just having curtains, you know, proper curtains and blinds and colours. You know, nice furniture. These are things that sort of represent, you know, your personality. They sort of take prominence when you do a refurbished house like this, you know.
Yeah, it's a really nice example what you can do, and maybe also an example that you don't need necessarily to do it all in one go. I mean, that is usually the pathway, in particular because you will be engaging in most of the cases someone. But if you can do some hands-on work, it's a nice example actually to look into that and make it work as well, even room by room, if you can't do it all at once.
I mean, that's what I was saying, like so we're doing it room by room because we're living there. That's what I was saying before. You actually have a little bit more control over the cost. For me, it's been a real learning exercise as well, even though, you know, I guess I know what architecture involves, but it's just been really nice to sort of do the hands-on kind of stuff. So these things really matter, and I think they're really good lessons. It's been great for my son, very young, basically starting in the industry. So not a lot of room, you know, because it's just refurbishing, sort of everything is there. You know, there's not a lot of room for mistakes, let's face it. And he's just starting out as a builder, in effect. So it's a good training ground for him. That's why I think young people or sort of retired people seem to occupy this kind of space, funnily enough.
Yep, which is good, because we need some passion. And out of that, there might be even new business models emerging. And I think we need that to keep actually existing buildings in that life cycle. That's our biggest chance, even to tackle the demand on one side, but also climate actions on the other side, and reducing actually the need for doing everything new. And I think that's a great way to look at it. And it's great to hear, you know, that the next generation gets passionate about these things. And we are talking, for example, I had even today a talk with someone who is fairly young, entering the market as a builder, so passionate about taking these actions seriously and really wanting to deliver great projects which meet actually the needs. And they consider, you know, their legacy, but also future generations, kids and everything. So all of this plays a part. I love actually that passion. And this is exactly why we even founded Evitat, to bring people together who share these same mindsets and the passion and the heart for these projects. So
maybe just before we get to the end, Sonia, there's this there's two more questions that have popped up.
Yep.
Firstly, just Antony, for your place, Darren in the chat is wondering what type of insulation you use for the walls and the floor. That's the first one.
It's a very good question. I can't remember, but it was a wool and it was very dense, and we used polystyrene at the bottom. I'd have to go back and check. So I can't answer the specifics on that, but I'm happy to get back to there's really good insulation available, you know, from, you know, the general hardware stores that are out there. So it's really about, you want to get the right density, and you want to make sure that you're not compressing the insulation into the walls or ceiling, so because then they become less thermally efficient. But you know, in terms of what's available out there, there's just some fantastic stuff out there. But it's what I would say about the house, it's an ongoing project. And it's about, you know, it's almost seeing the project as never being finished. So it's just always being improved. So to answer your question earlier, we've got one more room to go, which is the back living room. And then we can start on the exterior, which I'm really excited about, because then we can wrap the building, we can put solar on the ceiling, on the roof, and we can create, you know, nicer spaces externally. So, you know, it's a project that keeps evolving and giving life to me and my family.
Yeah, that's
so
nice.
And there is this one last question, and maybe Simona as well, and Antony. I mean, I don't know how much you guys have to do with green spaces or gardens, but the question is kind of around, what have you noticed recently as kind of trending requests or desires from clients when it comes to like green space in their projects and their gardens, and what are you kind of noticing that people are doing with that? Because, you know, your home's not just your inside, it's your outside as well.
I think maybe if I start, but I think one of the advantages of adaptive reuse is that, like, we've got a reasonable back property. It's about 350 square meters, which is pretty big. It's not huge, but it's big. And our house is about 130 square meters. So you could argue about 200 square meters of that block is garden, thereabouts. That's one of the really good benefits of adaptive reuse, is that you tend to stay with small footprint homes. And you get the opportunity to develop the garden. And it's been a very strong argument of mine with my family, is that by retaining the small footprint, we've got more opportunities to enjoy our garden, which is in fact the reason we bought the property, because we love the garden. So I didn't answer your question specifically, but I think one of the benefits of adaptive reuse is that gardens get preserved and can be made more of, because you're not consuming the whole site with house.
Yeah,
beautiful.
totally agree. Like you said, Antony, it's often, you know, when you buy a new house or a unit, you barely have any garden left. And if so, you have a few, whatever, grasses or maybe tiny shrubs or something in it, but you typically don't have established trees or even fruit trees or something. And often people that want to reuse their homes, they live in an area they really love. They love the neighborhood, you know, they love where they are, they love their garden. So, you know, it's one way just to keep the house and then, you know, redo the house a little bit. Or if you need more space, go, you know, double story, for instance, and still keep the garden. One thing what I've been seeing a little bit is, you know, like queen roofs, or, you know, when you're in more confined spaces, you know, where you don't have much garden, to make, you know, use of the roof space, but that can be quite costly and complicated, especially when you're existing conditions. So it's always a really, really good idea. But I had many cases where it turned out cost prohibitive because the work involved was just way too much. But yeah.
Yeah.
Green walls, everything that people are wanting or looking into?
Look, from my point of view, not so much. I think, you know, again, I think, you know, you've got to remember, if you're talking sustainability, I would view, you know, embodied carbon, efficiency of the dwelling or building as the real thing that is driving sustainability. I think landscaping is critical in terms of creating, you know, healthy environments for people to live in out externally. I think there's a little bit of, you know, I won't call it greenwashing, but a little bit of trickery with some of these things that you're seeing out there. Some are fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I'm not seeing so much of that in my own projects, to be really honest with you.
Yeah, I think there's a million of possibilities actually, maybe to utilize also small spaces. But if you have actually a decent size of a garden and it's established, it adds a lot to the quality of the home. We are actually contributing to that criteria within the logbook as well. So it becomes something to add actually that quality, making it visible. I will tap into that in a second. Coming back to Evitat as a platform and what it actually offers is an easy way to find vetted material suppliers and manufacturers, and being able to reach out to them, but also to understand the materials from various perspectives, for example, through your health needs, efficiency needs, and so on. So it's a really humanized way to approach these materials. And when I'm talking about vetting, that means all these suppliers and manufacturers need to have substantial evidence around their sustainability claims and provide that. We do also track and give you calculations on embodied carbon. And soon we are extending that for a range of other criteria. So there's a lot actually we want to roll out. So feel free to jump on to sign up if you haven't already and explore the platform. We are doing also regularly these webinars with a lot of really great insights. Maybe just to tap on the logbook, I quickly share my screen. And I can jump into an example. The logbook is free for any homeowner to start with, and really to see what improvements are contributing to a range of 6 different categories. So it's healthy home, the thermal comfort, affordability, efficiency, social environmental responsibility, and that comes a lot through the lens also of picking maybe the manufacturers who are locally manufacturing, for example, contributing also to local employment and so on. And of course, carbon emissions. We're talking not just about carbon emissions on operationals, on your footprint. We are also talking and considering the carbon emissions through material flows. And that's why we do feature, of course, a lot of even biomaterials. We tapped into wood fiber, for example, earlier, but also other, there's a range, even hemp solutions. And we're looking in also emerging materials into the market, but also established ones. There's a lot of really well run companies. They operate often enough with headquarters in Europe, and they have been operating for decades and really, really long, and have very well established like product ranges. So with the logbook, you can actually add a range of features, updates, upgrades, retrofits, from going off gas, all electric, to actually material choices. And I'm not just talking about insulation. There's also design aspects like passive design principles, or even certified passive house. So you can add that information, and it will basically then immediately update your impact meter. You can also now upload, for example, in documents, your own order documents of hot water heat pumps. So this is the first one we want to release. And that is a feature which will give you a very easy way to read out that information and add it into your logbook. So you don't even need to find actually the right name of your hot water heat pump. It will read it out automatically. And you just need to make sure that it's actually ticked in the logbook status report. This tool will give you in future the opportunity to demonstrate all the good things you have done over time to any future buyer, for example, but also for other critical, for example, there will be maybe insurances who will be asking you, you know, and confronting you maybe with higher policies due to your location. And then you can actually demonstrate, I've done some work here because we have talked also within the logbook around your location, around your climate zone, and maybe associated climate risk, which might come. And these are opportunities really to work and improve that home and have actually sustainable property value, because what we are facing is fairly uncertain. But improving it is giving you and your family great benefits, but it's also for a future buyer really assurance when buying a home, that they don't need to invest another $500,000 just to improve and create an affordable home. So these factors are really big. I think even Simona, you have gone through a full retrofit renovation a few years ago, before you actually went on the journey and building a certified passive house, or it's actually in the process to be certified. Yes. Maybe just let us know quickly your journey with the retrofit and renovation. What did you achieve, and where did it start?
Yeah, so we bought, I think back in 2010, the typical 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom quick veneer unit. So no insulation whatsoever, nowhere in the house, single glazed aluminium windows. And it was just freezing as I think I rated it, and it had 0.8 stars or something like that. And back then in 2010, everyone thought you're crazy, you're completely overcapitalizing, because we ripped off all the plasterboard from the external walls. And it was similar to you, Antony. We did it in stages. So yeah, we insulated all the external walls, we insulated the floor, we insulated the roof. Back then we imported UPVC windows from Germany, because the ones here I didn't like. They had a U value of 1.1 already back then. We installed a new kitchen, new bathroom, just LED light throughout. And we changed it from a really cold and freezing 0.8 star home to 8.4 stars. And it was really, really comfortable all year round. So it was a massive, massive change.
Yeah, it's a huge change, an incredible project. We have been featuring it in a previous webinar. So if you want to have a look, we maybe Daniel, you after the session, we might share actually the link to all the recordings again. And yeah, and I think it's a great inspiration as well to know what's possible. And even with like these typical units. And I think Antony tapped also in terms of these old, you know, maybe 5-6 unit little development. I think it's a real opportunity actually to even in the current market, because they often a bit neglected, but they have a great established environment with beautiful gardens usually, or trees. They're well located as well. And you can make actually incredible efficient homes out of them. So it's a real good way to look at it. So, and this is exactly where the logbook will help. Yeah, if you have any questions, if you want to you know, ask even Antony or Simona, maybe after the webinar, something, jump into community. We're more than happy to answer that there directly. And you can also reach out to both of them through the platform or directly through the website. So Antony, I'm conscious of time. We didn't actually add too much. So I want to thank you. This was a great session about adaptive reuse and the opportunities and also the challenges involved, but a great outcome. And thank you, Simone and Danielle, for being with me tonight and taking us on the questions and everything. So yeah, enjoy everyone the evening, and we will see each other soon. Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.